October light sits low over the Kansas flatlands, and the air smells like the end of something. Harvest dust still hangs in suspension, golden and thick, drifting across county roads that haven't seen rain in 3 weeks. Every field for miles glows orange at dusk. Neighbor after neighbor reaches for a match, and the stubble catches fast. Walls of flame rolling clean across the cut rows, smoke columns rising straight into a windless sky. One field stays dark. 320 acres, just east of Pratt County, owned by a quiet man named Elias Cord. No debt. He had paid off his last operating note in the spring of 1998 and had not borrowed against the land since. The stubble stands exactly where the combine left it, unburned, untouched, straw laid flat across the soil like a blanket pulled tight. The county agent drives past, slows down, shakes his head. He calls it foolish. Elias says nothing. That silence is where this story starts. The nutrient burn. What smoke actually carries away? Let me tell you what was rising into that Kansas sky with the smoke, because it was not just carbon and water vapor, and it was not just the smell of something ending. It was the farm's future fertility, leaving the county at roughly 12 miles per hour, and nobody standing at the fence line watching the flames could see it go. To understand what Elias was refusing to do that October morning, you have to stand at the edge of a burning field in the Oklahoma Panhandle, a field nearly identical to his in Pratt County, roughly the same soil series, the same crop rotation, the same post-harvest window. The combine passed through 2 days ago. The farmer has touched a match to the windward edge, and now a line of orange fire, maybe a quarter-mile wide, is walking steadily east. The smoke is not thin. It is a brown-gray wall, dense enough to blot the tree line on the far side of the section, and it carries with it something that researchers at Oklahoma State University spent the better part of the 1990s measuring down to the decimal point. Here is what that research actually found, and the numbers are not gentle. When a wheat or grain sorghum field is burned after harvest, somewhere between 98 and 100% of the nitrogen stored in that straw is volatilized and lost. Gone. Not leached into the subsoil, not locked into microbial biomass, not waiting in some recoverable form just below the surface. Gone into the atmosphere in a single afternoon. Nitrogen that took an entire growing season to fix, to move through root systems, to deposit into stem tissue, erased in the time it takes to drive to town and back. The carbon numbers are worse, or at least more dramatic to visualize. Approximately 90% of the carbon stored in above-ground residue leaves the field as smoke. 90%. Carbon is not just a nutrient in the narrow fertilizer sense. Carbon is architecture. It is the scaffolding that gives soil its structure, its water-holding capacity, its ability to support the microbial communities that make every other nutrient available in the first place. When 90% of it combusts in one afternoon, the field does not just lose a number on a soil test. It loses years of biological construction, compacted into a column of smoke that the wind disperses across 3 counties before sunset. Stand at the edge of that burning field and watch the ash settle. It looks like something has been cleaned. The ground is black and flat and oddly neat, the way a swept floor looks clean even when the dust has just been moved somewhere else. Farmers who burned for decades described the look approvingly. A fresh start, they said, a clean seedbed. And in the very short term, the ash does release a pulse of potassium and some phosphorus back to the surface. That pulse is real. Oklahoma State documented it. But it is a pulse that lasts 1 season, drawn from a reservoir that took a decade to accumulate, and it comes at the cost of everything else the residue was doing. Elias Cord understood this, or at least he had arrived at the same conclusion through a different route. The route of watching his soil test numbers over 15 years, while his neighbors' numbers went flat or declined. He is not a man who quotes university research at the dinner table. He is a man who keeps records in a green spiral notebook, 1 entry per field per year, going back to 1987. Yield, rainfall, input cost, soil organic matter percentage. The notebook sits on a shelf in his equipment shed, next to a coffee can of spare bolts and a radio that only gets 1 station. If you ask him why he stopped burning, he will flip to a page from 1994 and point at a number without saying anything. The number is 1.8. Soil organic matter expressed as a percentage in his south field after 3 consecutive years of post-harvest burning. His neighbor's field, same soil series, same rainfall, same crop rotation, measured 1.7 that same year. They were identical, they had both been burning, and they had both arrived at the same diminished baseline. Then Elias stopped. His neighbor did not. By 2003, Elias's south field measured 2.4% organic matter. His neighbor's field measured 1.6. That divergence, 0.8 percentage points over 9 years, Does not sound like much until you translate it into what it means at the root zone. Each 1% increase in soil organic matter allows an acre of ground to hold an additional 20,000 gallons of water. Elias's south field by 2003 was holding somewhere in the range of 16,000 more gallons per acre than his neighbors. Not because of rainfall, not because of irrigation, but because of what he had not burned. The county agent who shook his head driving past Elias's unburned stubble in October was not a careless man. He was working from the same framework that had guided recommendations in that part of Kansas for 40 years. Burning controls disease pressure. Burning eliminates the habitat for certain insects that overwinter in residue. Burning gives the planter a clean pass in the spring. These are not invented benefits. They are real, documented, and in some cropping systems genuinely significant. The county agent was not wrong about any of them. What he was not accounting for was the compounding cost on the other side of the ledger. Every year that a field burns, it starts the growing season with less nitrogen, less carbon, less biological activity, and less water holding capacity than it had the year before. The inputs required to compensate for those losses go up. The yield ceiling, absent significant fertilizer additions, goes down. The soil becomes progressively more dependent on external inputs to perform at the same level, which means the farm becomes progressively more financially exposed to the price of anhydrous ammonia and urea, which are themselves derived from natural gas and priced accordingly. Elias Cord, standing in his equipment shed with his green spiral notebook, had not run this calculation in those terms. But he had watched his input costs stay flat while his neighbors crept upward, and he had watched his yields hold steady in dry years when the fields around him struggled, and he had formed a conclusion that he would not have phrased as a nutrient cycling argument, but that amounted to exactly that. The smoke rising from the burning fields around him every October was not just carbon and nitrogen. It was the compounded interest on a biological account that his neighbors were drawing down year after year without realizing the principal was shrinking. The county agent's dismissal echoes across the fence line, carried on the same wind that carries the smoke. He will drive past Elias's dark, stubbled field again in the spring. He will note that the neighbor's field has a cleaner seedbed. He will not yet note that the neighbor has ordered an extra ton of nitrogen fertilizer to compensate for what burned in October. That accounting comes later, and when it does, it will raise a question about water, about what happens to rain when it hits bare, burned ground versus ground still covered in standing straw, about an invisible sponge that either exists beneath the surface or does not, depending entirely on what was done with a match in October. The Wind Erosion Test. Dust Storm, 2012. Now let me take you to the summer that settled the argument in the most unforgiving way possible. Not in a university greenhouse, not in an extension bulletin, but across millions of acres of open plains ground under a sky that had stopped cooperating entirely. If you lived anywhere near the Great Plains in 2012, you remember the sky. Not the blue kind, the brown kind, the kind that moves toward you like a living thing. A wall of displaced earth rolling across the horizon at 30, 40, 50 miles an hour, swallowing fence posts and mailboxes and the outlines of farmhouses whole. Meteorologists called it a haboob. Farmers called it something else entirely. Whatever name you gave it, the meaning was the same. The land was leaving. The drought of 2012 was the worst single-year agricultural drought the United States had seen since 1956. Across Kansas, Oklahoma, Colorado, Nebraska, and the Texas Panhandle, topsoil that had taken thousands of years to build was being picked up and relocated in an afternoon. The USDA estimated that some counties lost more than 5 tons of topsoil per acre in a single wind event. 5 tons per acre. Gone in an afternoon. And here is the thing about wind erosion that most people do not fully appreciate until they watch it happen in person. The wind does not take the bad soil first. It does not discriminate in favor of the farmer. It takes the lightest particles first. And the lightest particles in any field are the organic matter, the decomposed residue, the biologically active fraction, the exact material that makes the difference between soil that grows crops and dirt that grows nothing. Wind erosion is not random destruction, it is a targeted theft of the most valuable thing you have. Now consider 2 fields side by side on a flat stretch of ground in Pratt County, western Kansas. Both fields were planted to winter wheat the previous fall. Both came through a dry spring. Both are sitting under the same sky on a July afternoon in 2012 when the brown wall arrives from the southwest. The first field was burned in October. The farmer who owns it had burned his stubble clean. He wanted a tidy seedbed. He wanted to be rid of the disease pressure. He wanted to start fresh. So he lit the match, and by November his field was a flat, dark, open plain of exposed soil. By the time July arrived and the drought had baked that surface into a fine, powdery crust, there was nothing standing between that crust and the wind. Not a stalk, not a stem, not a single inch of vertical structure to interrupt the airflow racing across the surface. The second field belongs to Elias. Elias did not burn. His stubble is still standing. Not tall, not dramatic, but present. Wheat stubble after harvest runs maybe 8 to 14 inches above the surface, depending on how the combine was set. It is not a forest. It is not even a hedge. But it is something. It is vertical structure in a landscape that has been stripped of every other vertical thing. When the dust wall hit, the difference between those two fields became visible from the road. On the burnt field, the surface wind, the thin, lethal layer of air moving fastest right at ground level, had nothing to slow it down. Aerodynamic roughness, the technical term for the friction a surface creates against moving air, was essentially zero. The wind accelerated across that flat open plain, the way water accelerates when a river narrows. It scoured, it lifted, it carried. Within minutes of the storm's arrival, a visible plume of brown dust was streaming off the burnt field's downwind edge, joining the larger wall of displaced plains topsoil moving northeast. Soil moisture measurements taken after the event on comparable burnt plots in Pratt County showed surface layer losses averaging $38 per acre in replacement fertility costs, a figure the county extension office quietly circulated in its post-drought report that fall. On Elias's field, something different happened. The standing stubble, those 8 to 14 inches of dried wheat stems spaced across every square foot of the field, created what agronomists call surface roughness. And surface roughness does something remarkable to wind. It breaks the laminar flow. It disrupts the smooth, fast, ground-hugging layer of air that does the actual lifting and carrying of soil particles. Research published through Kansas State University's extension program demonstrated that standing crop residue can reduce surface wind speed by as much as 60% compared to bare, burned ground. 60%. That is not a marginal improvement. That is the difference between a field that stays in place and a field that leaves. Because wind erosion does not scale linearly with wind speed, it scales with the cube of wind speed, meaning that if you cut wind speed in half, you do not cut erosion in half. You cut it to 1/8. The physics of particle transport are brutal and unforgiving in one direction, and they are equally powerful in the other direction when you have residue working for you. On the burnt fields around Elias, soil loss that day was not abstract. It was visible. You could see the surface lowering. You could see the rills forming where the wind found a gap in the shelter belt, a low spot in the topography, a place where the soil was just slightly finer and lighter than the surrounding ground. Farmers who walked their burned fields after the storm found the surface had moved. In some places, the wind had deposited a thin gray film of someone else's topsoil. In other places, it had excavated down to a harder, less productive layer that had not seen daylight in decades. The biological work of a generation, the earthworm channels, the fungal networks, the aggregate structure built year by year in the topmost inches, had been lifted and scattered across 3 counties in a single afternoon. Roy Hatch saw it. Roy Hatch is a man who had farmed the same ground his father farmed, and his grandfather before that. He is the kind of farmer who does not say much, who measures his words the way he measures his seed, carefully, without waste. He had burned his own stubble that October, same as always, same as everyone. He had watched Elias leave his standing and thought privately that Elias was making a mistake, that the residue would cause problems, that the old way was the old way for a reason. On that July afternoon in 2012, Roy Hatch pulled his truck to the side of the road at the section line between his field and Elias's field. He sat there for a long time. His field was streaming. Elias's field was not. The visual line between them was as clear as a fence. Clearer than a fence because it was drawn in the language of soil and wind and physics, rather than in the language of wire and post. Roy did not get out of his truck. He did not walk over to Elias's field and take a sample or measure the surface or ask for an explanation. He just sat there, engine running, watching the dust come off his ground and not come off Elias's ground. He rolled the window down partway. The air tasted like dirt, and whatever he was thinking in that moment, he kept it to himself. That silence, Roy Hatch sitting in his truck at the section line, watching, is the image that stays with you. Because Roy was not a foolish man, he was not a man who ignored evidence. He was a man who had been taught one thing, who had practiced one thing for decades, and who was now watching that thing fail in real time while the alternative held firm 50 feet away. Elias passed Roy's truck on the way back from checking his own field. He slowed. Roy did not wave him down. Elias kept driving. There would be time to talk. But first, the storm had raised a question that went deeper than wind, deeper than surface roughness, deeper than the visible drama of dust moving across a Kansas sky. Because the drought of 2012 was not only a wind event, it was also a water event. And what happened to Elias's field when the rains finally came? intense and sudden, and the kind of rain that a parched landscape cannot absorb the way a healthy landscape can. That is where the story gets strange. The water mystery, infiltration, and the invisible sponge. Most people think about rain as something that falls and either soaks in or runs off. Simple binary. The ground is wet or the ground is dry. The rain stays or the rain leaves. But that framing misses almost everything important about what actually happens in the first few seconds after a raindrop hits a field. And it misses the reason why two fields sitting under the same storm cloud can respond to the same rainfall in ways that look, to a bystander on the road, almost physically impossible. The summer of 2012 did what Great Plains summers sometimes do after a prolonged drought. It broke, not gently, not gradually, but in the way that only an atmosphere holding months of suppressed energy can break, with fast-moving thunderstorms that dropped 2 and 3 inches of rain in less than an hour on ground that had been baked to near-concrete hardness by weeks of 100-degree temperatures. The agronomists have a term for this kind of event: high-intensity, short-duration precipitation. Farmers have a different term for it, and it is not printable. For the burned fields, that rain was not relief. It was a second disaster wearing relief's clothing. Here is what happens when a heavy raindrop, and a raindrop in a thunderstorm is not a gentle thing, it is a small projectile moving at terminal velocity. When that raindrop strikes bare, burned soil directly, the impact energy is transferred straight into the soil surface. The surface particles, already loosened by months of drying and cracking, are physically dislodged by the impact. They become suspended in the thin film of water forming on the surface. And as that film begins to move, because bare, compacted soil does not absorb water fast enough to keep up with the 2-inch-per-hour rainfall rate, those suspended particles travel with it. They flow into the low spots. They flow toward the field edges. They flow into the drainage ditches. And as they flow, they do something insidious. They seal the soil surface behind them. The fine particles settle into the pores between the larger soil aggregates, blocking the very pathways that water needs to move downward into the soil profile. Agronomists call this process surface sealing or crusting, and once a crust forms, infiltration, the movement of water from the surface down into the soil, drops dramatically, sometimes to near zero. So the burned fields around Elias that July did not absorb the rain. They shed it. Water moved across their surfaces in sheets, carrying topsoil with it, collecting in the low corners of fields, running out onto roads, pooling against fence lines. Farmers watching from their porches saw their fields flood and thought, well, that is what happens when it rains this hard after a drought. They were not wrong exactly, but they were missing the variable. Elias's field did not flood. Roy Hatch, who had driven back out to the section line when the storm broke, because Roy Hatch was the kind of man who needed to see things for himself, who had been sitting with the memory of that dust storm for weeks and was not finished processing what he had witnessed. Roy watched from the cab of his truck as the rain hammered both fields simultaneously. His field, the burned field, sheeted almost immediately. Water ran in visible streams toward the low corner near the road. He could see it moving. He could see the surface turning glossy and then turbid as the soil began to mobilize. Elias's field did not sheet. The water disappeared, not slowly, not reluctantly, but with a speed that Roy found genuinely unsettling. He later described it, and Roy Hatch was not a man given to dramatic language, as watching the field drink, like watching a thirsty animal drink. The rain hit the stubble, ran down the stems, reached the soil surface, and vanished. What Roy was watching was the invisible sponge at work. The stubble cover that Elias had left standing was doing several things simultaneously, and each of them was compounding the others. First, the physical presence of the residue was intercepting the raindrop impact energy before it could reach the soil surface. The droplets hit the stems, hit the matted residue lying between the stems, broke apart, lost their kinetic energy, and arrived at the soil surface as a gentle flow rather than a ballistic impact. No impact energy meant no particle dislodgement. No particle dislodgement meant no surface sealing. No surface sealing meant the soil pores stayed open, and open pores meant the water could move. But the stubble was doing something else, something less obvious and more profound. Over the months since harvest, the residue had been slowly decomposing at its base, feeding the soil biology beneath it, and that biological activity, the fungi, the bacteria, the earthworms working through the surface layer, had been building and maintaining the soil's aggregate structure. Soil aggregates are the small clumps and clusters that give a healthy soil its characteristic crumbly, almost granular texture. They are not just aesthetically pleasing, they are functional architecture. The spaces between aggregates are the macropores, the large channels through which water moves rapidly downward into the soil profile. burnt soil, stripped of its residue and its biological activity, loses aggregate stability over time. The aggregates break down, the macropores collapse, the soil becomes dense and structureless, and its ability to accept water, its infiltration rate, falls accordingly. Elias's soil, protected by residue and biologically active, had maintained its aggregate structure through the drought. When the rain came, the macropores were open, the water moved. Research across multiple Great Plains states has quantified this difference. Fields with maintained residue cover consistently show infiltration rates 2 to 4 times higher than comparable bare or burnt fields. Studies measuring soil moisture retention have found that residue mulch conserves between 20 and 35 millimeters of additional soil moisture compared to bare ground across a growing season. 20 to 35 millimeters. In a dryland farming system where the difference between a profitable crop and a failed one can come down to a single critical rainfall event arriving at the right time, that stored moisture is not a rounding error, it is the margin. There is a temperature dimension to this that rarely gets the attention it deserves, and it operates quietly, season after season, compounding the same way the biological losses from burning compound. Bare soil in a Great Plains summer is a solar collector. It absorbs heat during the day and radiates it back upward at night, and the surface temperatures it reaches are not gentle. Soil surface temperatures on bare, burned ground in July can exceed 60 degrees Celsius, that is 140 degrees Fahrenheit, in direct afternoon sun. At those temperatures, the soil biology suffers. The fungi that build aggregate structure are heat sensitive. The bacteria that cycle nutrients are heat sensitive. The germinating seeds that a farmer is trying to establish are very definitely heat sensitive. The seedbed that looks clean and ready after a burn is, in the heat of a Great Plains summer, a hostile environment wearing the costume of a prepared one. Elias's stubble cover was acting as insulation. The residue layer shaded the soil surface, reflecting solar radiation and blocking direct heat transfer. Soil temperature measurements taken under residue cover consistently run 5 to 10 degrees Celsius cooler than bare soil temperatures in the same conditions. 5 to 10 degrees Celsius. That is the difference between a soil biology that is active and productive and one that is stressed and suppressed. That is the difference between a seedbed that is biologically alive and one that is biologically exhausted. And over 15 growing seasons, that difference accumulates in the soil the same way every other difference accumulates. Invisibly, incrementally, and then all at once when a drought year finally arrives to run the test. When Elias was ready to plant in the fall of 2009, the year he made the full commitment to no-till on every acre, he was not working with a conventional drill. He had acquired a Great Plains 3S3000 no-till drill, a machine designed specifically to cut through standing and matted residue and place seed at precise depth and spacing without disturbing the soil surface. The coulters on that drill cut a narrow slot through the residue and into the soil. The seed drops in. The press wheels close the slot. The residue stays in place around the seed. The soil stays undisturbed. The sponge stays intact. Roy Hatch watched Elias run that drill across his field that fall. He watched the machine move through the standing stubble without clearing it, without burning it, without doing any of the preparatory work that Roy had always understood to be necessary before planting. And he watched the field close behind the drill as if it had barely been touched. He had questions. He had been accumulating questions since October of the previous year, since the smoke columns rose from every field but Elias's, since the dust storm showed him the section line in the language of wind and loss, since the July rain showed him the invisible sponge drinking while his own field ran. But the questions Roy Hatch was forming in that moment, standing at the fence line, watching Elias's drill work through the residue in the long slanted light of a fall afternoon, those questions were not yet the most important ones. Because what happens underground, in the soil itself, in the biological economy that residue either feeds or starves depending on what a farmer does with a match in October, that is where the real answer lives. The living soil, earthworms, microbes, and the underground economy. Now let me describe Elias on one knee in the dirt, because this is the moment the whole story turns on and it does not look like much from the road. He is not looking at the sky, not watching a dust cloud, not measuring water in a jar. He is holding a single handful of soil from his south field and he is counting. Not counting bushels, not counting dollars, counting worms. 5 in one handful, then 7. Then, in a patch near the old fence line where the stubble has been standing undisturbed for the better part of a decade, he loses count past 12 before the soil crumbles and they disappear back into the dark. This is the underground economy. And it is the most important thing happening on Elias's farm that no satellite, no county agent, and no neighbor with a match has ever been able to see. Start with the earthworms, because they are the most visible sign of something invisible happening at scale. In burnt fields, the kind that cover the county around Elias's land every autumn, earthworm populations collapse. The surface fire itself does not kill every worm, but it removes the food source. No residue, no organic matter, no reason for the population to hold. Studies tracking earthworm density across burned versus unburned agricultural plots consistently show that populations in no-burn fields triple within 5 years. Triple. Not increase modestly. Not trend upward. 3 times the worm count in the same soil type, same rainfall zone, same crop rotation. What those worms are doing is aerating, channeling, pulling organic matter downward, and depositing castings that are among the most biologically active materials in any agricultural system. Every worm moving through Elias's soil is building a tiny tunnel that holds water, admits air, and feeds the next layer of life below it. And that next layer is where the story gets genuinely strange. Microbial biomass carbon is not a phrase that shows up in most farming conversations. It is not printed on a seed bag. It does not appear on a commodity price board. But it is the single most accurate measure of whether a soil is alive or dying, and it builds or collapses invisibly, season by season, year by year, in ways that only show up in the data long after the decisions that caused them were made. When you burn stubble, you do not just remove carbon from the surface, you sterilize the top centimeters of soil with heat. Fungal networks that took years to establish, the mycorrhizal threads that connect plant roots to phosphorus and water sources they could never reach alone, those networks char and break. Bacterial colonies that process nitrogen into plant-available forms get disrupted. The microbial community that was quietly running a nutrient recycling operation more sophisticated than anything a fertilizer company has ever engineered goes quiet. And then the next season's crop has to start from scratch, relying on chemistry from a bag instead of biology from the ground. Elias never burned, so Elias never reset the clock. Season by season, his microbial biomass carbon built, quietly, invisibly, the way interest compounds in an account nobody checks. By year 5, his soil was processing residue faster than his neighbors' fields could absorb synthetic inputs. By year 10, his root zones were hosting fungal communities dense enough that soil scientists who pulled cores from his field started asking questions they had not planned to ask. And the number that captures all of it, the single metric that tells you whether 15 years of patience paid off, is soil organic carbon. Burned fields in Elias's county average somewhere between 1 and 1.5% soil organic carbon. That is a number that reflects decades of combustion, tillage, and biological reset. Elias's field, after 15 years of standing stubble and no fire, tests between 1.8 and 2.1% depending on the zone. That is a 20 to 40% increase over the county baseline. It does not sound dramatic until you understand what soil organic carbon actually does. It holds water. Roughly 1 gram of organic carbon can hold up to 8 grams of water. It feeds microbes. It stabilizes aggregates, so the soil does not crust, does not compact, does not blow. Every 0.1% increase in soil organic carbon is a measurable improvement in the soil's capacity to survive stress. Drought stress, heat stress, compaction stress, the kind of stress that turns a bad year into a crop insurance claim. The complication, and there always is one, is that the transition years are hard. The first 3 seasons after Elias stopped burning, his yields were uneven. The residue was heavy, the no-till drill was new to him, and the biology he was trying to build had not yet reached the threshold where it could compensate for the inputs he was pulling back. In 2001, his north field came in 4 bushels per acre below the county average, and the county agent made a point of mentioning it. Elias wrote the number in his green notebook and said nothing. He was not farming for 2001, he was farming for 2022, and the distance between those 2 years was the only argument he was willing to make. Then there is the satellite data. NASA's NDVI, the Normalized Difference Vegetation Index, which measures how green and photosynthetically active a field is from orbit, shows something on Elias's 320 acres that the county map does not explain. In drought years, when the fields around him go pale and stressed and the greenness drains out of the landscape from above, Elias's field holds its color longer. Not by a little, by weeks. The satellite images from the 2022 growing season show his field as a noticeably greener rectangle inside a patchwork of yellow and brown. The underground economy was paying dividends in the one currency that actually matters when the rain stops: resilience. This is not unique to Elias. That is the part that matters most. Gabe Brown, a rancher and farmer in Burleigh County, North Dakota, has been documenting the same trajectory on his own land for over 20 years. Brown stopped burning in the mid-1990s, reduced tillage, added cover crops, and watched his soil organic carbon climb from less than 2% to over 6% over 2 decades. His earthworm counts mirror what Elias found: populations that multiplied beyond what his neighbors thought was possible in a northern plains soil type. His water infiltration numbers, his microbial biomass data, his NDVI signatures during drought years. Every number echoes what the soil on Elias's 320 acres has been quietly building since the morning his neighbors all reached for their matches and he did not. Brown ran into the same resistance Elias did. His county agent told him in 1996 that he was overcomplicating a system that had worked fine for his father. His input supplier suggested, not unkindly, that he was leaving money on the table by pulling back on nitrogen. Then he said, in a meeting at the local co-op that year, something that the farmers in the room did not forget. The soil is not a substrate. It is a community, and you either manage it or you mine it, and eventually the mine runs out. Brown talks about soil as a living system, not a growing medium. He uses the phrase underground livestock for his microbial populations, organisms he is managing, feeding, and protecting with every decision he makes above ground. It is a frame that sounds almost whimsical until you run the numbers, and then it sounds like the most practical thing a farmer can say. Because here is what the underground economy actually produces, in terms a balance sheet can hold. A field with triple the earthworm population needs less tillage to maintain structure. A field with robust mycorrhizal networks needs less phosphorus fertilizer because the fungi are sourcing it from zones the roots cannot reach. A field with 20 to 40% more soil organic carbon needs less irrigation per yield unit because the water holding capacity is doing work that would otherwise require a pump and a well. A field where microbial nitrogen cycling is running at full capacity needs less synthetic nitrogen per acre because the biology is already converting what is in the residue. Every one of those reductions is a cost that Elias is not paying. Every one of those inputs is a line item his neighbors write a check for every spring. The underground economy does not show up on a single season's ledger. That is why it is so easy to ignore and so devastating to destroy. Elias has been making deposits into a biological account for 15 years, and the balance has been compounding the whole time, in the dark, below the frost line, in the castings of worms and the threads of fungi and the respiration of 1 billion microbes per teaspoon of healthy soil. His neighbors have been making withdrawals with every match, and now, standing in that field in the late summer of 2022, with the drought bearing down and the county average yield already trending toward disaster, Elias is about to find out exactly what 15 years of patience is worth when the numbers come in from the combine. The harvest that silenced the county agent. The county co-op that had supplied most of Elias's neighbors with anhydrous ammonia and urea for 30 years closed its Pratt County location in the fall of 2023, squeezed out by consolidation and the slow arithmetic of customers who kept needing more inputs to hold the same yields. The closure was announced in 2 sentences in the weekly paper. Nobody marked it as the end of anything. In 2022, a drought year when burnt fields across the county averaged yields that sent farmers to the insurance office and the bank. Elias's 320 acres came in 16% above the county average on